Welcome to the Lafayette Library and Learning Center's Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm Beth Needle, the Executive Director of the Foundation, and this evening we're pleased to welcome author Anne Raeff. And many literary achievements include the 2015 Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction. She was a finalist for the California Book Award and named one of the best 100 books of 2016 by the San Francisco Chronicle. She was also a finalist for the Simpson Literary Prize, a project our library is glad to be a proud member of. Tonight, Anne will read from her new book, Only the River, and will be interviewed by her wife and prominent author, Lori Ostlund, who is also, by the way, who won a Flannery O'Connor Award. They live in San Francisco, along with Justice and their 2 cats. So welcome, and please find Anne's books at our partner bookstore, Orinda Books in Orinda, or at your local independent bookstore. Thank you. Anne, Lori, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming on this Sunday afternoon.
So we have actually just run up the hill. So we arrived back, we just came from a protest. We ran up the hill, and I think Anne decided we had time to either brush our hair or change our shirts.
Except I never brush my hair.
Yeah, and I did not change my shirt. So here we are, fresh from the protest. Very happy to see all of you and welcome you to our dining room. Just so you can kind of fully picture it, we have Justice is actually sitting here. He's come from the protest with us. He is in his kimono, eating pistachios. His sole job this afternoon is to let Anne know when she's mumbling. So when you hear an uptick in her enunciation, you will know that Justice is doing his job. And it's really great to be here. Thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction. And shout out to you for being quite possibly the first person ever to pronounce Anne's last name correctly. I know she appreciates that. I'm actually going to pronounce it correctly also, but I have kind of the inside scoop on that. And Sarah is working behind the scenes, both of them at the Lafayette Library, and we are so happy. So the way this came about, way before the pandemic happened, we were set to do a interview like this, not from our dining room, however, from the library itself out in Lafayette. And then when the pandemic, when the lockdown started, Anne wrote to them and said, well, what if we did something online? And so at that time, my questions were kind of reflective, I think, of the pandemic. They were really, we were inside the house, neither of us writing, really busy, and thinking, I think, about ideas and maybe our lack of ideas and creativity and the role of art in all of this. And then, so I started to think about questions related to that. And then George Floyd was murdered a couple of weeks ago. And so that kind of changed again, the mood and maybe the scope of what we were planning to talk about. Anne doesn't actually know. What I'm saying, I'm just nodding. She's just nodding. She has no idea what I'm going to ask her. We both prefer that.
What she was thinking.
Yeah, no idea what I was thinking. But a couple of, maybe a week ago, we were having dinner, the 3 of us, and I had just finished reading the news, and I said that I was feeling quite cynical. And Anne, in an attempt to see, she had no idea I was going to say this. She said, I don't know, were you quoting Marx? Is that how you were quoting?
She's quoting somebody.
She told me that.
It wasn't Marx, it was somebody.
She told me that cynicism was a sign of laziness. And so, you know, as a Midwestern former Protestant, I was quite upset.
Attacking you personally. I was just,
yeah, no.
It was not the right time to say it.
But this afternoon, the 3 of us went to the Children's March in our neighborhood. And so we've just come from that. Blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks of people walking together. And so I'm feeling a little bit more hopeful, I think. I think all 3 of us are. So nonetheless, the scope for the day is still kind of to think about how how this book in particular came to exist, and where ideas come from and where art comes from, but then to kind of spill over into this whole idea of what art means at a time like this, and whether that might be a way to stave off cynicism. I thought before that I would begin by kind of positioning, and we're very different writers, and I think that makes for an interesting relationship, work relationship and personal. But I thought I would begin by positioning her work, and so I went and pulled out a review of her book a couple of years ago, her book, short story collection, that won the Flannery O'Connor, The Jungle Around Us. And I thought I would read just a little section. The reviewer was Hugh Sheehy, and he was writing in the Los Angeles Review of Books. And he was quoting the secretary of the Swedish Academy, Horace Engdahl, and who was explaining why Americans rarely win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And Engdahl said, the US is too isolated, too insular. They don't translate enough and don't really participate in the big dialogue of literature. That ignorance is restraining. And then Sheehy goes on a few lines later to say, his sentiment is easy to appreciate, and not only in the sense that American authors tend to write about American characters in American spaces. Even when American authors look abroad, the real concerns often lie at home. At the end, he kind of as the lead in to talking about Anne's book, he says, fortunately, those of us annoyed by the thought that American letters are predestined to cultural solipsism, there are new and recent books that prove some American authors are toiling on the assumption that the Roman playwright Terence was accurate in saying nothing human was alien to him. When Hugh wrote this, he was talking about the jungle around us, but I think that I certainly, and I believe Sheehy would also, place Anne's most recent book, Only the River, in a similar place, I think. So I want to talk a little bit more about your family history and maybe how that's contributed both to the creation of this book in terms of where ideas come from, but maybe to this position that I think you're in as a writer, someone who is writing about the United States, but also is writing about other places and not necessarily writing about them only in terms of the United States. So I want to begin by just giving a quick summary of the book for those who haven't read the book. Anne can jump in and join me. We normally, one of the great things about being two fiction writers is that at dinner parties, if one of us is asked to explain the plot or what one of our books is about, the other one just does it. It always is easier that way. So I asked Anne if she wanted to set up her book, and she said she wanted me to set up her book. So I'm going to set up her book, but she's probably going to quite often jump in and explain what I got wrong. The other thing I'm going to say is that I've read this book probably 10 times, but I've read it in many different iterations. And so the interesting thing about doing that is that they all kind of blur in my head. And so I know the book inside and out in some ways, and yet I know that things have changed. So the book is told in multiple voices. It begins with one of the main characters, maybe the main character, Pepa. And Pepa, as the book begins, is 85 years old. She's living in New York, but Pepa was born in Vienna, and she and her family left Vienna, 1938? 1938.
They escaped from Vienna.
They escaped from Vienna in 1938, and then ended up in Bolivia, or ended up in Nicaragua via Panama. When they're spending these war years in Nicaragua, she falls in love with a local boy.
And she's a young girl when she arrives. She's 14.
She's 14, and she falls in love with a local boy named Guillermo. She and her family end up getting visas to New York, and they go to the United States. So the story is really two generations in a sense. We're following Pepa's life in New York, and we're following Guillermo's life in Nicaragua, but we're also seeing the next generation.
And we're also seeing their life together in Nicaragua before they separated. That's
And
large
we're,
part of the
yes.
book.
So Pepa has two children. One of them is William, and William I think somewhat inspired by his mother's stories of Nicaragua, ends up going in the 80s to Nicaragua to join the Sandinista revolution and never returns. His assumed death is a mystery throughout the book. Guillermo has a daughter who does the same, Fernanda. She also joins the revolution back there in her country, in Nicaragua. Pepa has another child, her daughter, Liliana. As the book begins, Liliana has left her girlfriend in San Francisco and come to New York with a broken heart, and her mother kind of sends her to Nicaragua to see if she can learn what happened to William all these years ago. Does that seem like a good setup?
Mhm, that's
Okay.
good. All right.
So
I'm ready.
that is the setup. So what I was thinking is that along the lines of talking about where ideas come from, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about your family history and how it informed maybe the content or gave you the ideas for the story, but also how it informed maybe the way you write, your perspective on the world, and what you didn't want to know the questions beforehand.
Okay, yes, okay. So yeah, so in a nutshell, this is my mother's side of the family. So my mother's from Vienna. She was born in Vienna, and when she was 12, they escaped from Vienna. They left Vienna. They ended up in Panama because they had a distant uncle that had started a business there, had left there actually to avoid being drafted into the army for the First World War. Anyway, so they ended up in Panama. They stayed there about a year. They tried to get visas to come to the United States. That didn't work. They applied to many places, and they ended up in Bolivia. It was the only place that they were able to get a permission to come to. So my grandparents were both doctors, and my grandfather got a job working for the Bolivian government as the doctor to take care of the workers that were building the railroad. They were connecting Brazil and Bolivia. They were building the tracks, and there was a lot of yellow fever was one of the problems there. And so my grandfather was off working, with the railroad workers. In the meantime, my mother and my grandmother and my uncle were living in this town called Trinidad in Bolivia. It was a village at the time, and my mother didn't really go to school. She hadn't liked school when she was in Vienna, so she didn't go to school. And she talks of this time as being this sort of idyllic time. She was free. She did, she explored all these things. And but when my grandmother was largely depressed during that time, and so that was also, so it was difficult. So it was kind of this strange sort of in between years between, the life that they knew in Vienna and then and New York, which would be more familiar to them. So so on my father's side, his parents were Mensheviks. They were sort of the soft side of the Russian Revolution. They were socialists basically, and under Stalin, my grandfather was working in Germany at the time. He was an engineer, and then when Stalin came to power, they decided just not to return to the Soviet Union, and so they lived in Germany until 1933. Then Hitler came to power. They moved to France. The Germans invaded France. They finally were able to escape to Portugal. They stayed in Lisbon for about a year until they could come to the United States. So both my parents had this life they were refugees, and a lot of upheaval and all of this. So that definitely informed my life. And I think that, you know, that my life was very calm. My parents, you know, went to college, they had their professions. I grew up in the suburbs of New York and New Jersey, you know, in a pretty affluent community, went to good schools and all of those things, and which was very different. And my parents wanted that stability, but still in the background was this always this history. History was just very much a part of my consciousness. I mean, and I talked to my grandparents a lot. They told me, I was curious about the stories. So my grandparents on both sides told me stories, and my parents were pretty open about telling me stories. So at a very young age, I kind of understood that the world was much bigger than, you know, Tenafly, New Jersey, which is where I grew up, and that that what happens in different parts of the world can affect, you know, has this ripple effect and affects people throughout the world and next generations and all of these things. So I think that, and my parents also, they spoke a lot of different languages because they'd lived in so many different places. So for me, the world, I grew up with a sense that the world was big and that cataclysmic events in history changed the world forever and changed people's lives forever and set them on a completely different course than they thought they would be on.
Which is one of the preoccupations, I think, or one of the themes of all of your books. And as you were talking, I was thinking about that essay of yours that I love, which I had not even planned to talk to you about, but your relationship to German,
Mm-hmm.
because I remember how much that struck me. So Anne's first language was German, and that was the language she spoke at home, unlike, I think, so many of the people in the town where you grew up who were also.
Well, unlike my closest friend, my best friend, whose parents were from Germany, and they refused to speak German at all, except for the grandparents who didn't speak English well enough, but they really just did not want to. They cut ties completely with anything German culture, you know, no German knives even could be in the house, no German car, you know, everything. And my parents, I think, because they had, you know, been in a lot of different places, and also it was their temperament, and, you know, that was the language that they shared. They both spoke German, and they wanted us to have another language. So it was kind of a practical solution to speak German so that we would be bilingual. And that worked until I got to be about 12, and then it just became more and difficult for us to keep up the German as our conversations got more sophisticated and things like that.
And you didn't learn Russian. I remember, I think that all couples kind of have these stories that for them are stories that they learn early in a relationship that are kind of defining stories. And in particular, I think because our backgrounds are so different. One of the stories that I always remember, and it wasn't even the story you were telling, it was just kind of an incidental, but it was the story about your parents going to hang out with some of the other Russians. And then part of the story was that Stalin's daughter was at this party. And I didn't even know what to make of this, that Stalin's daughter was there. But that is one of the, it's one of my favorite memories. When I was thinking about where ideas come from, I do want to circle back to Nicaragua, but since we're talking about this, one of the things that I was thinking about, and I think it's exclusive to being two people who are both fiction writers. People always ask us what it's like to both be fiction writers. And I think, you know, there are many ways to answer that question. And sometimes people want to know the bad things, the ways that we argue. And we're not going to talk about that today. I'm sorry, you'll see us argue, but we're not going to actually talk about the arguments. And sometimes I think they want to know, you know, kind of it must be so great, people will say. And that's usually, you know, someone who has a spouse that does something completely different. But one of the things for me that's most fascinating is that because we've been together for almost 29 years, we've known each other for 30 some years, we have a lot of shared experiences. We travel together, we go through life seeing somewhat the same things. And so what happens when we both sit down to write is that we sometimes are writing about the same things. Quite often we'll just, you know, we'll leave a dinner party Anne will say, oh, so-and-so said this, and
Well,
that's
we write
yours.
about similar, a lot of same places because we've been into those places together, like Morocco.
But some
Ukraine,
incidences
yeah.
come up. And so one of the things I was thinking about in terms of where ideas come from, how different this book would be if it were not for our trip to Ukraine. And I was hoping you could talk just quickly about how Ukraine came into this book.
Okay. Well, okay. So the one of the places, that probably the only place in our whole time together that I have been to without Lori is Nicaragua, which is very strange because the reason I kind of got to know it is that when I was teaching high school, we took students to Nicaragua and, traveled with them and we worked for us. We did work with a school for developmentally disabled adults and teenagers. And so I got to know Nicaragua that way. But Lori never came on those trips. So that's really strange. So I have this whole connection with this country. It's the one place that Lori doesn't share that with. But
yeah, that's why. Are you drawn to writing about it more because of that?
No, I just think I was drawn to it because I'm drawn to, to the themes. I'm drawn to the ideas of, revolution and what happens when revolutions go awry, or what happens when revolutions are, cut in before they even have a chance to do anything. I'm interested in these kind of attempts that human beings have to radically change the world, and that is part of it. And I'm interested in Latin America. I spent a lot of time before I knew Lori. One of the most important events in my life was after I finished college. I went to Spain. I lived in Spain. So everything that has to do with Spanish, I'm very close to the language. And so I'm drawn to Spanish-speaking countries. So
is that also because of your mother?
Yes, I think it is because of my mother. I think that was, even though we grew up speaking German and all these things, but German has, German is the language of the Nazis, and I find German amusing, and I find it amusing to speak in German. I don't feel there's really a close connection to it, but one of the reasons I went to Spain is I wanted to kind of know more, because my mother, that basically Bolivia saved my family. I wouldn't even be here if it hadn't been for that. So I think I was drawn to, and my mother's stories, were very, she was also pulled into the warmth of the culture, and I think she felt safe there. And so I was interested in that. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to learn Spanish. And I think I feel more of it. In the last discussion, Oscar Villalon asked me about this idea of having like these double immigrations. Like, can you feel this connection to a place that you don't really have roots in, or a genetic connection to, but somehow this historical connection? I feel somehow there's some tie that I feel to Latin America because of that, those 5 years, they not just metaphorically, but just sort of, they're just part of how I think of the world and how I think of myself. So, which is not to talk now, talking about Ukraine.
No. I actually, the question preceding this, you never know how things are going to kind of circle around. The question preceding this was really for you to talk about Nicaragua and what drew you to that. But we were talking about your father, and that somehow led me into Ukraine. And I do think it's interesting because I'm also writing about Ukraine right now, but what I'm writing about Ukraine bears no resemblance to what you're writing about what you wrote about Ukraine in this book.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking that you could talk just in terms of the experience and then what led you to write about it.
So the reason I wrote about Ukraine really is partly because I was there. And there's so many reasons I wrote about Ukraine. It just kind of, the main reason though is that when I was in Nicaragua with my friend and former colleague Suzanne Motley, she agreed to go with me on this this trip to go on the river where this book takes place, where I imagined that this book would take place, but I had never been there. I just read about it. So we went and we took this trip. We spent 3 weeks traveling in Nicaragua, and we talked to a lot of people when we were on this trip. And I originally was interested in the canal that they were planning on building, because there was this idea that would join some Chinese, billionaire, and Daniel Ortega had some kind of idea to build another canal, which would cut through Nicaragua, cut through some of the most pristine rainforests in all of the Americas. And I was worried about this. So that was my original idea, was to go and talk to people about how they felt about this, what they thought about it. In the process, you're on the bus, you talk to people, you're on the boat. It's, on these lanchas that you go on the river, it takes, like 9 hours to go, 100 miles or something. So you're on these, boats for a long time, and there's a lot of time to talk. And we met a few people who had, during the revolution, been in Eastern Europe. They were sent to Eastern Europe to be trained for something, And
no, I mean, not for, you're making it seem like you don't know what they were being sent to be trained
to be
for.
trained, like to do like mechanics for factories, or to learn how to do, be pilots, or, things that would help industrialize Nicaragua once the revolution kind of took hold. And so we spent quite a bit of time talking to this one guy who had been in Bulgaria, and he had gone to learn how to fix factory equipment. And, he talked about what it was like with the snow and all of this stuff. And, and I was intrigued by this, because that was sort of another connection. So it wasn't just the connection with my mother's side of the family, this is a connection with my father, who was from Russia, and, they escaped, they basically fled Stalin and communism and all this stuff. So there was that kind of tied that side, because I also grew up with a lot of people who were basically refugees from Stalin, from communism. And so that kind of this perfect marriage there, right, in Nicaragua. And I didn't really know that. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I kind of knew it about like Cuba, that there's this connection with the Soviet Union, but I didn't realize to what extent that was happening in Nicaragua, even during the short period of time that the Sandinistas were in power. And then Lori and I went to Ukraine. Largely, we went to Lviv, which is where my maternal grandparents were. My maternal grandmother was from, and so because they were actually immigrants in Vienna. My grandparents both were young when they came to Vienna with their families. My mother was born there, but they were actually from Lviv, which was known as Lemberg at the time. It was part of Poland, now it's part of Ukraine. It's Galicia, that part of Western Ukraine. And so we traveled there, and we kind of got to know the city, not super well, but we had a different feel for it. We went to the Jewish cemetery and looked for, like the maiden name of my grandmother. We looked at the graves. We spent a lot of time there. And then we went to another city, which is in the book, which is called Kamenets-Podilsky, because one of our friends here is from there. And she said, well, if you go to Ukraine, then you have to go there. And she got us she got introduced us to her school friend, her whole old friend from school, and they showed us around. And so we got this sense of that city. So it's all kind of a mixture of the present life that you're living, and with the past, and the themes, and everything just kind of comes together. And I chose Ukraine, sending this particular character, Federica, to Ukraine, because that was really the place that it was fresh in my memory, and I felt like I had some kind of tie to it because of my grandmother.
So, well, I actually was going to ask you to read, and I have, as you know, the only thing I told Anne were the 3 sections that I might want her to read from, and they're small pieces. You're not going to have time to read from all 3.
Okay.
I'm thinking maybe that little piece from the Nicaragua section would be good now.
From the first chapter?
I think from the first chapter.
Okay.
Well, yes.
Okay, I'm going to read. This is just a very short section, but it gives you a sense of what we've been talking so much about, all these theoretical things in history and revolution and this and that. But this will give you a sense of what it's like in this little town called El Castillo, which exists, and what the river is like. And so this is just the last kind of page of the first chapter, where Pepa is her daughter is, very upset because she's just left everything, that her whole life in San Francisco. Her girlfriend has left her, and so she's kind of calming her down and doing this thing that she used to do with her and her brother to kind of bring them back to El Castillo, and so that they could feel it. And so she says, in El Castillo, you can smell the river in the bed sheets, and the sound of rain on the tin roof overpowers the human voice. I know, Liliana said. Knowledge is not the same as experience, Pepa said, as she always did when Liliana and William begged her to tell them about the river. Take us there, take us to El Castillo, they would say, and Pepa would begin as she did now. Close your eyes, Pepa said, switching to Spanish. Can you hear the motor of the lancha? Liliana nodded. She could hear it now, the motor of the lancha getting closer and closer. Sometimes when she and William were lying on the floor in the living room, when the air was thick and still and there wasn't even the memory of a breeze coming off the Hudson, she was able to feel a warm rain falling on her, and she would open her mouth to let the water flow in. What are you doing? William would ask. I'm drinking the rain, she would say. What does it taste like? It tastes like mangoes. What are you doing? I'm watching the monkeys. And what are they doing? Laughing. Shh, their mother would say. If you talk too much, it will all disappear. Put your hands in the river. It's warm. Can you smell it? Pepa said now. Yes, Liliana nodded, as she has done many times before as a child. Listen to the motor and the lapping of the water against the lancha. There on the right bank are some herons sunning themselves. Now you are coming around the bend. Soon you will see the Spanish fortress on top of the hill. It's so big the houses of the village looked like toys in comparison. Look at the houses, all those colors. Ours is pink, but you can't see it from the river. Can you hear the falls? The lancha is approaching the dock now. There is Don Solano's shop and there is the church. Don't take your hand out of the river, not until you're there, not until the lancha has pulled into the dock and the driver cuts the motor. Sleep, she said. You are safe now, Pepa whispered, as she did when they were children. Sleep.
Thank you, Raeff.
You're very welcome, Lori Ostlund.
So I actually have a couple more questions
Yes.
about where ideas come from, but I'm going to what?
Tie to today, like you said you were going to do.
Yes, that's so what I was about to say was that I'm going to actually set those aside for a moment. I have 2 full pages of questions. I came over prepared, basically,
Yes.
is what I'm saying. So, but I do want to switch gears a little bit. And before I do that, I want to remind people that there is a Q&A, a place to ask questions. And so you can start typing questions. I'm going to open that up in about 10, 15 minutes, not right now.
Yes.
But I want to let people know in case they type slowly that they can start putting questions in there. But I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about William. William is the son who goes to Nicaragua, and William is interesting for me for a couple of reasons. He, in some ways, feels to me like the beating heart of the story. He doesn't actually have a point of view until the very end. It was interesting for me to look at the end and realize that his is kind of the last word. But he's the one that propels the plot in a way, but he also really does feel in some ways like the beating heart, and is my feeling, or my feelings about how change happens have been all over the place in the last couple of weeks. And so I was looking at William and also something that Guillermo says, and they kind of land on opposite sides. And what Guillermo says is, I cannot imagine wanting anything so much that I would die or kill for it. And then we have William on the other side, and there's a section that I asked you to read, a very brief section about William, and this is what it was kind of leaning toward. Maybe you can read that section about William, and then we can talk a little bit more about it.
Okay, here goes. Yeah,
So
I see, yeah. Okay, this is the first time he's really introduced as a character in the book. When he was a boy, William showed no interest in guns or swords. He liked baseball, not football. For a while, he was interested in birds and begged his parents to buy him a parrot. He collected acorns and chestnuts and did not complain about taking slow walks with his grandparents in Fort Tryon Park. He did not get angry when Liliana broke his toys or when his parents said that he could not have ice cream. But in the 4th grade, he became a fighter. He punched a girl in the nose because she made fun of another student, a shy girl who held her pencil too hard and wore the same dress every day. Their father cried when he found out what William had done. But I was protecting her, William said. A few months later, he punched a neighborhood boy in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him for throwing a rock at a stray cat. This is our secret, he told Liliana after the boy ran away, William calling after him that the next time he would hit him even harder. You didn't have to hit him, Liliana said. I don't like it either, but sometimes it's the only way, William explained. You could have just told him to stop, Liliana said. William laughed. That's not the way the world works. In middle school, he got into a war of wills with his US history teacher, who required the students to learn the Declaration of Independence backward by heart. One by one, they stood in front of the classroom to recite it while she smirked, waiting for them to make a mistake, at which point she told the student to sit down and flamboyantly recorded an F in her grade book. When it was William's turn, he walked to the front solemnly, bowed to the class, and proceeded to declaim. He made not a single mistake, and when he was finished, he bowed again and instructed the class to follow him out the door. That is the end of this futile exercise. We are leaving this dictatorship, he pronounced, but no one followed him. Who's next? The teacher asked as William slammed the door, shattering the glass.
That's actually one of my favorite character descriptions in the book, but maybe of all of your character descriptions.
Why, thank you.
You are very welcome. I remember the first time I read that. It's still quite vivid for me, that description of William. And I do keep coming back still, though, to what Guillermo said. I cannot imagine wanting anything so much that I would die to kill for it. And I'm not even sure what my question is so much, but the things that I found myself thinking about maybe have to do more with kind of taking my pulse over the last couple of weeks and thinking about how I answer that question of what's required for change. And, you know, I often quote from my students something that Chekhov wrote in a letter to his editor who's taking him to task for one of his endings. And he said that, you know, the role of the writer basically is not to answer the questions, it's to ask questions well.
And I feel I don't have the answer to that question. I mean, I feel also there are different times in my life where I feel angrier and more ready to kind of not necessarily physically fight, but really get into a fray about it or want to tear things down. And there are other times when I still hold to my kind of sort of pacifist beliefs, and you know, I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's interesting to look at different characters that have, you know, that can represent that,
those two sides,
and not to make it, you know.
Well, I'll give you two direction possibilities to go with.
Okay.
So one of the things I was thinking about, and this takes it more back to the idea of writing, and that is how women write about violence, and whether you have any thoughts about that, because you do write about violence. The other direction you could take it in, because I've been thinking a lot, and just finished the most recent thing she wrote. I misstated things when I said that neither of us are writing. She, in fact, just wrote an essay. And every day, her mother is in a residency in New Jersey. And
a retirement place.
Yes, a retirement place. A retirement place is what I meant to say.
Yeah.
So they have had a lot of COVID cases there. And Anne's mother has kind of just been inside and has retreated from the world, I think, for several years. She's in her 90s, and she feels quite alive now. She feels quite engaged with the world. And I think that started with COVID, but then as she watches what is going on, and so that's the other direction you could take it in, is to maybe talk about your mother, who it's interesting what she says when she kind of compares the beginning of her life and having to run from Vienna and Hitler and the end of her life. So either or both of those.
Well, I don't know really, writing as a woman about violence. I mean, I think that women do think about violence differently. I think which is probably why, I don't know, I think that I have a more female approach to fighting, which is not about physical violence.
Okay,
but
Justice is saying that you're using your throat
I'm
voice.
using my throat voice, okay.
The mumbling
Because I'm
voice.
trying to figure it out. But, I think it's interesting because, my mother can't help but see like comparisons, obviously, between, what happened in Germany before Hitler came to power and then right after he came to power and what's happening now. And this sort of conflagration of all different things that, can lead to something very, very scary. Can you please take that away? It's making me, I don't want to be reading that now.
Okay, I was
Thank
looking
you.
at it from me.
And so, but what's interesting is also her fluctuations with it. There are times when she's very despondent, and she's sure that Trump is going to keep hold on to power no matter what, or stop the elections from happening, and that he will refuse to leave office and send in the military. And in the beginning, when she talked about these things, I was a little bit more skeptical, and now I'm increasingly less skeptical as things go on. And so I think she has that perspective, and I think that, but ultimately, even now, I mean, I just do feel that what I'm interested in people who, that's what William is, somebody whose whole life is this obsession with justice and with change. And a lot of times those aren't the people that, that's what revolution is about. That's what, the original communist revolutions were aiming to do, and they're not successful. So I don't think there's really one answer to how to approach, how to deal with violence, how to write about violence, how to think about violence. I just think that the main principle is that you can't let the theory overrun the actual effects that it has on human lives. And I think that's, for me, what's the most important thing. You can have this theory, yes, we want to create a world where everybody's totally equal. That's great. But if in the process of that millions of people die, well, then that doesn't work. And so that is where I come to with violence. Does violence happen but if you keep in mind this always, that each individual life is valuable and important, that every life matters, then you're less likely, I think, to fall into those ideological traps and get into this, wrapped up into all of these isms that have created so much pain for human beings: racism, and communism, and nationalism, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, all of these things, all of these kind of grandiose, very sometimes well-intentioned and often very evil ideas,
So, well,
I don't know if that was a good answer or not.
No, I'll let you know later.
Okay.
I'll let you know later. So I am going to actually, when Anne kind of turned and scowled at me and said, "That's bothering me, don't open that up right now." You have no idea what she was talking about, but what she was talking about was actually the Q&A section. So some questions were starting to come up.
Yeah.
And so we have a question here from
Karen.
Karen. Karen, good to so nice to see you.
Yes.
It just
Hello.
occurred to me. So you are pointing out the fact that Anne's novel, and this is perfect in terms of this idea. Well, I'm supposed to ask the question because they can't answer. So nobody can see this, only we can see this. So my job is to first pose the question. So Karen's question is, She's talking about the fact that The Doctor's Daughter, the short story The Doctor's Daughter, which was in Anne's Flannery O'Connor winning book, the first story of that, The Doctor's Daughter, was the germ for this book. It's the story of Pippa and Guillermo meeting. And Karen is wondering, did you know when you wrote the story that you would want to further explore Pippa and Guillermo's world?
Well, I think when I wrote the story, no, I didn't know that. But in a sense, subconsciously, I did know that because this is a story that has been with me my whole life, you know. Ever since I was little, I heard about Trinidad and the town and what it was like to live there. So I think that when I was writing the short story, I thought it was a short story. I didn't think that it would go on. But at the same time, I can't imagine that I wouldn't have written about this eventually. And then what I had to do when I realized that these characters weren't leaving my head and that I needed to write more about them, I switched them because in The Doctor's Daughter, they are in Bolivia. It's a short story, but I realized I couldn't write a whole novel about a place I had never been. So that's where I kind of switched the focus to Nicaragua because that was a place that I knew. Thank you.
So I am going to, my next question basically is from Anne Kane. Do you think you will write about what is currently going on in our world, either the virus and or racial justice?
Well,
maybe, and I'm going to add to that maybe a question that if Anne Kane, if I can add to this, I'm curious about this, whether fiction requires a certain distance from things. I always think of journalists as people who are writing the immediate, and fiction requires a degree of retrospection. So I'm wondering whether you could maybe add that to the question.
Well, it's the serendipitous things happen. I mean, it's very strange. This happens to me a lot in my writing, where I write about something and then that thing happens. I mean, it's not that I have psychic powers or anything. It's just that this is the zeitgeist and these are the things that I'm thinking about. One of the biggest examples of that, this is a little bit of a side thing, but I wrote in my last book, I wrote about, it was a secondary character that had a kind of big effect on one of the other characters who had ALS, and I did quite a bit of research about ALS, and I knew one of my friends from when I was growing up, her father had ALS. And so I kind of put that in the book. And then just a year after that, my father was diagnosed with ALS. And so that just seemed, anyway, so that I'm saying that because I have been, before the pandemic, I was working on another book that started in Madrid, kind of talking, and it was kind of talking about the heroin epidemic in Madrid that happened right after at the end of fascism during the first years of democracy. That's when I lived in Madrid, and it was kind of that, and that character. There's a character then that comes back, grew up in San Francisco, goes to Madrid. I won't give you all the details, but then she comes back to San Francisco right when the AIDS epidemic is beginning. So I was writing this whole thing about the AIDS, about this character and her family and her relationship with that, and so that's already there. Now I see like the third epidemic is going to have to be this pandemic, and obviously issues of racial justice are already in the book before I even started any of this happened. So that's kind of where my focus was. I guess that's what I was thinking about. That was there already.
So Leah asks a question that's interesting, and it's a big question. So I'm wondering whether I can find a way to maybe ask you to zero in on. But the question is basically, how do you do research for cultural, historical, and geographical accuracies? So maybe I'm going to start out by acknowledging what I think is true, and that is that you always write about places that you have some connection to, that you've been to, that you have a feel for.
Or that I've lived in, or, yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about the cultural and then the historical accuracies and how you do. It's certainly big question.
It
how
is a
you-
big question. I mean, mostly, yes, I don't, I mean, I definitely write about things that I have a personal connection to, so that already it's places and people that I'm already interested in because I have a personal connection to them, either through my family or through my own experiences. And so I feel like the research comes from life, from, you know, interacting with people in different places, and also from reading about things that I'm interested in, being in a place that, you know, so I feel like those things I have to be kind of immersed in that already. I don't think, oh, this is something interesting, and then I start reading, or that I go there. In this case was different. This case with Nicaragua, though, I did go to Nicaragua specifically to kind of do that kind of research for this book, because I wanted to go to this river. It's very symbolic. It's the river where people, because the canal would have destroyed the whole habitat around the river, everything about the river. It was a river that was once, you know, where steamboats went. It's how people went to the gold rush. They went down, they basically went down there and then crossed this river up to the Pacific. So, so it's this very sort of fraught place, and I needed to know it, and I need to spend time there. I need to smell it and taste it and feel it. And I did read quite a bit about the history of the river, and the early, you know, the early conquest in Nicaragua, the battle between the British and the Spaniards there, and things like that. So I think when I start with a position of connection, and then I expand that based on what is needed. I mean, for my other books, I didn't go to places to do the research as much, because I had either been there or I heard these. I mean, but most of my research is really from kind of these, from my own experiences being in a place and being with people, and or my family's stories. And then obviously you have to do the certain things, you know, you have to get the dates right. You have to get the, you know, stuff like that. That's just, you look up things. Yeah.
I remember, well, and probably, I'm not going to tell this story, you can if you want to, but I do remember after your first book came out and we were having dinner with your aunt.
Yeah, I don't want to tell that.
Yeah, who was upset about, and kind of asking
yeah.
questions about whether your generation had the right to tell stories about the Holocaust. And your response in a nutshell was, if my generation doesn't, then who will? Sarah Stone, well, so Sarah, Only the River is gripping, such great characters, plot descriptions, yes. Reading it feels like living the story. I admire your restraint in allowing the events to carry the meaning. Do you find yourself deliberately embodying ideas or paring back on ideas? How do you hold everything as you're writing and revising?
Well, that's an interesting question. For me, the writing process is pretty intuitive. So I just kind of write. But one thing that Lori always warns me about, I do have these thematic things that I want to address. And so when I do kind of get off track is when I'm focusing too much on the theme and not just on letting the characters go, and where they go, then the themes happen. So a lot of times when Lori and I will be taking a walk and I say, oh, I have this idea, I want to do this and this and this. And Lori's like, just forget about the theme, just write the story. So I think that's kind of what I do with that, and that helps me. So whenever I find myself too much thinking consciously about theme, I have to make myself pull away from that.
Yeah, I think we're both similar in that way, and prefer people to tell us stories rather than. Yeah, I know. I was looking at Joe's. It went. Where did it go? It was here.
Where's Joe's question?
I don't know.
I think you have to get rid of some of them.
No.
You have to dismiss them in order to.
Joe DePrisco, you had a question.
Oh, there it is.
There it is. And there are clear thematic connections between Winter Kept Us Warm and Only the River. But were the challenges and pleasures for you as a writer different? In other words, what are your reflections about your growth and aspirations as a writer in the middle of your wonderful career? Joe, that's actually my last question for her was, what she was learning about each of her preoccupations, which is very similar. You actually worded it so much better. So I'm going to let your question.
Well, I think that this book came more easily. I mean, it was kind of, I feel like I struggled so much with Winter Kept Us Warm to find the right, I went through so many iterations, and even to find who the right characters were, what the point of views were. I think I was still working that out. I think maybe that's where I was too focused on theme in the beginning, and it took me a while to get into the actual, really figure out what the characters were supposed to be doing. I feel like this book came more naturally somehow, and I feel like I allowed myself just to let it go wherever it was going. I didn't have so many preconceived ideas about what it was going to be. I mean, I started out thinking that the whole thing was going to be about the canal, and then that just, I just let that go rather than, keep at it. So I feel like I felt it was more, I felt less pained when I was writing this book than when I was writing Winter Kept Us Warm. And I think also with the style, I tried to do something different stylistically. I tried to make it more kind of lyrical, I think. And I was interested in that. I wanted, there's a lot of poetry. There are a lot of allusions to poetry. There's a lot of poetry in the book, a lot of Lorca, and I was trying to evoke, wanted to do something different with style. So for the first time, I wrote more extensive. I never really thought that I would write so much about nature. And I didn't feel like I was writing about nature, but it came out that way because I just kind of let it happen. So.
Well, and it also was about the river.
Yeah.
So there was actually one more question I wanted to get to, but
Yeah.
I looked at the clock and we are out of time.
No, are we not? We can still have another question, right? It's not
well,
like there's a clock.
I wanted to, Sylvia asked a question
yes.
that I wanted to get to about the way that your teaching feeds into your writing, and or are the two avenues of work in different spheres of your imagination? Do you compartmentalize, or
not at all?
Not?
They're so connected. I can't imagine doing one without the other. And I think I've talked about this a lot, and I think about this a lot, that I feel like teaching is a way for me to understand perspective. It's taught me so much about perspective. I interact with all different kinds of people that I might not otherwise interact with. I have to figure out how to kind of present things in all sorts of different ways, not just in the way that I understand it, which is what a writer does, right? You have to make something come alive. You have to make people care about it. You have to create emotion, and that's what a teacher does, create this emotion, this passion, this connection that they can find to whatever it is that they're learning or reading. So I couldn't be a writer without being a teacher, and I think my writing, informs my teaching too, because it's about stories. I mean, teaching is telling stories. I tell a lot of stories when I'm teaching.
And don't you think on a very pragmatic level, at least this is true for me, that there are some days that teaching is just an escape from my writing that I need at that moment. I need to go and care only about somebody else and not my own concerns.
And the other way around, writing is an escape from teaching, which can be very hard and often very frustrating. And you don't see the progress. It takes a long time, before you see the effects sometimes. And so both of them I think you have to be very creative to do it, and you have to have a lot of patience,
So on that note, I'm going to hold Anne's book up, Only the River. I know that Orinda Bookstore, which normally works with the Lafayette Library, has the book and would be very happy to sell it to you. But thank you again, Lafayette Library, and thank all of you for being here. It's very odd to know that you're there and not to be able to see any of you. I've enjoyed reading the notes that many of you have sent. And most of all, thank you, Anne Raeff, for sitting with me here at the dining room table.
Okay. Can I speak now?
Yes,
okay.
You've been speaking. I think it's not that you've said nothing until now.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing this, obviously. I know I'm being too formal, but no, thank you to the Lafayette Library. Thank you, Beth and Sarah, for putting all this together. Thank you, everybody who's come. And yes, please support Orinda Books, if you can. They've always supported the author series and all the events that the Lafayette Library does. And your other local bookstores, please support them. I think that they're opening up now. And so the more business that we can give them, the better. And
Black Lives Matter.
yes,
That's the final word.
okay. Final word, Black Lives
Have-
Matter.
Have good evenings, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. This is the awkward time.
Because
we
we
don't know
don't
whether-
actually know how to leave this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right here, leave, but should we